The distress beacon screamed across 3 frequencies. Lieutenant Cale Rodger stood at the edge of the orbital drop platform, watching his classmates frantically check their survival packs. 47 species represented, 300 cadet officers, one planet below that had already killed 6 training cohorts. The Vraxis instructor's scales rippled crimson, the color of imminent danger. Final equipment check, she hissed through her translator. Your packs contain everything required for 72 hours planetside. Lose your kit, fail your exam. Fail your exam, return to your homeworld in disgrace. Cale quietly unzipped his pack and began removing items. Emergency beacon, atmospheric processor, thermal shelter, nutrient synthesizer, all of it 50 pounds of cutting-edge technology went into the return bin. He kept only the knife. The Vraxis instructor's head snapped toward him. Around the platform, cadets turned to stare. A Torgathian's 4 eyes widened in collective horror. Human, the instructor rasped. What are you doing? Cale tested the knife's edge against his thumb. Getting ready, ma'am. The planet designated GX447 rotated below them, like a green-brown marble wrapped in storm systems. Indigenous megafauna, toxic flora, electromagnetic interference that rendered most sensors useless. It was chosen specifically because it couldn't be conquered with technology alone. Survival is not guaranteed, the instructor continued, her attention pulled back to the briefing. Extraction occurs at 72 hours from 3 designated zones. Your pack's beacon will guide you. Work alone or form alliances, both are acceptable. But understand, we are testing your ability to adapt using the tools your civilization provides. The Zentarie cadet next to Kyle, a crystalline being whose name translated roughly to harmonious thought cascade, chimed nervously. The human has no tools. The human will die. Maybe, Kyle said quietly, sliding the knife into his belt, but probably not. Through the viewport, lightning arced across GX447's southern continent. The drop pods waited in neat rows, each one a titanium coffin that would punch through atmosphere at terminal velocity. The Vraxis instructor's eyes found Kyle again. Human Rutger, you have violated protocol. Explain yourself or be disqualified. Kyle met her gaze. With respect, ma'am, I'm following protocol exactly. The regulations say we must survive with what we bring. They don't specify a minimum. I've chosen to bring what I trust. The murmur spread through the assembled cadets. Most species in the Galactic Coalition had evolved past physical hardship. Their homeworlds were tamed, their survival instincts dulled by 10,000 years of technological comfort. Humans were different. Earth had tried to kill them for 3 million years. Ice ages, predators, disease, starvation. Every generation had clawed survival from a world that offered no mercy. Even now, with Earth terraformed and civilized, humans still went to their wild places, still tested themselves, still remembered. The Torgathian officer candidate called Vex Thoran spoke up, his voice synthesizer crackling. This is foolishness. The human seeks attention, nothing more. When the storms come, he will beg for rescue. Cale shrugged. You're welcome to bet on that. I do bet, Vex Thoran snapped. 500 credits says you signal for emergency extraction before the first night. You're on. The instructor's scales flickered orange, irritation mixed with curiosity. In 20 years of running this course, she'd never seen a cadet voluntarily discard their equipment. The regulations technically allowed it, but the assumption had always been that doing so meant suicide. She studied the human. Young by their standards, maybe 25 orbital cycles. Calm eyes, steady hands. Something in his bearing suggested he'd done this before. Very well, human Rutger. You will proceed as chosen. But know this, if you trigger your emergency beacon, you fail. No exceptions. Cale nodded. Understood, ma'am. The pods fell like metal rain. Inside his cramped capsule, Cale breathed steadily through the bone-rattling descent. Around him, he could hear other pods on the comms cadets screaming, vomiting, praying to their various deities. The Zentari's harmonics reached ultrasonic frequencies of pure terror. Cale watched the altimeter drop and mentally reviewed what he knew. Temperate zone, likely near water. hardwood forest analog based on the preliminary scans. Native fauna mostly avoided areas with volcanic thermal vents. Sulfur content made them sick. The storms came from the Western Ocean every afternoon without fail. He'd grown up in the Pacific Northwest before the expansion. He knew forests, knew rain, knew how to read a landscape and find what he needed. The pod hit with a crunch that collapsed the shock absorbers. Restraints released. Door blew open on explosive bolts. Kale emerged into green chaos. The forest canopy towered 200 feet overhead. The air tasted like copper and ozone pre-storm atmospheric pressure. In the distance he could already hear the other cadets, equipment alerts beeping, voices calling out in confusion, the electric whine of emergency shelters auto-deploying. He closed his eyes and listened past the noise. Water. Maybe half a click northwest. The sound of it moving over rocks, which meant elevation change, which meant natural shelter possibilities. Kale drew his knife and started walking. By the time the afternoon storm hit, Kechal had established a basic camp. He'd found a limestone overhang near the stream. Good drainage, natural wind protection, elevated enough to avoid flash flooding. The knife had stripped bark from a rubber tree analog for waterproofing. A quick friction fire using the knife's spine against a chunk of flint had given him flames before the rain started. Now he sat cross-legged under the overhang, feeding small sticks into his fire, while the storm turned the forest into a gray wall of water. His improvised shelter was crude compared to the thermal units the other cadets had deployed. But it was working, and more importantly, it would keep working. The knife had already proved invaluable, cutting saplings for a basic lean-to frame, shaving tinder, cleaning a fish analog he'd caught in the stream using a technique his grandfather had taught him, patience and cupped hands. The flesh cooked over his fire now, seasoned with leaves from a plant his scanner implant identified as non-toxic. It wasn't synthesized nutrition paste, but it would do. Through the rain, he heard the first emergency beacon, then another, then a dozen more, all triggered within minutes of each other. The electromagnetic storm was worse than predicted. Across their training zone, survival equipment began failing in sequence. Atmospheric processors choked on moisture they couldn't filter. Thermal shelters designed for stable energy draws flickered and died as their power cells drained fighting the cold. Emergency beacons transmitted into static. Vex Thoran huddled inside his failing shelter, watching the power indicator drop towards zero. Around him, the forest had become a nightmare of mud and darkness. His thermal suit was useless. The heating elements had shorted in the humidity. He'd managed to activate his distress beacon, but the confirmation signal never came, just crackling static. The Torgothian's four eyes tracked movement in the darkness. Something large circled his camp. The local predators, it seemed, had learned that the beeping glowing shelters meant easy prey. Vex Thoran reached for his emergency plasma cutter and found the ignition cell dead. He was going to die because his technology had failed. The irony was not lost on him. The mudslide started on the eastern ridge at 0300 hours. Cal woke to the sound, a low rumble that vibrated through the limestone. He was on his feet instantly, fire-banked, knife in hand. The slope above the main encampment zone was giving way. He could hear it, the snap of trees, the roar of displaced earth, and underneath it all, the screaming of cadets who'd set up in the valley for access to flat ground and water. They'd done what their training taught them: find resources, establish base camps, deploy equipment. They'd forgotten to read the terrain. Cal was moving before he consciously decided to. His camp was safe, high ground, solid rock underneath. He could stay here, complete his 72 hours, pass with flying colors. But that wasn't an option, really. He'd heard 20 different voices down there during the day, 20 beings from 20 worlds, all struggling with an environment they weren't built for. The knife went back in his belt. Cal started running toward the valley. He found Vex Thoran first. The Torgathian was trapped under a fallen tree, his shelter crushed, water rising around him. The predator that had been stalking him had fled the mudslide, but Vex Thoran wasn't moving. One of his legs bent at an angle. Legs shouldn't bend. Kale dropped into the mud beside him. Easy, I've got you. Human. Vex Thoran's voice synthesizer sputtered. You should leave me. Save yourself. Not really my style. The knife came out. Kale wedged it under the tree and used a rock as a fulcrum, basic lever mechanics. The tree shifted 6 inches. Enough. He dragged Vex Thoran clear, improvised a splint from straight branches and vine cord, then hauled the Torgathian up the slope towards stable ground. The Zentari was next. Harmonious Thought Cascade had climbed a tree to escape the mud, but was now hypothermic, their crystalline structure fracturing in the cold. Kale started a fire, sheltered them with his own body heat. Then came 3 more, then 7, then a dozen. By dawn, Kale had 22 cadets huddled around 4 fires he'd built, wrapped in improvised shelters he'd constructed, eating food he'd foraged and cooked. His knife was notched and dull. He'd never been more proud of a tool in his life. The extraction shuttles arrived at hour 72 to find an unexpected sight. Most of the cadets were clustered around a series of primitive camps on the eastern ridge. They were wet, exhausted, and humble, but alive. Their high-tech equipment lay scattered and useless across the valley below. At the center of the camps, Lieutenant Kale Rutger sat by a fire, sharpening his knife on a river stone. The Vraxis instructor's shuttle landed first. She emerged, scales flickering through a dozen colors as she processed the scene. Report, she demanded. Vex Thoran stepped forward, leaning on a crutch Kale had fashioned. Ma'am, Human Rutger successfully completed the survival exercise. Additionally, he prevented 22 casualties through direct intervention. I formally withdraw my earlier comments about his judgment. The instructor's eyes found Kale. You left your designated zone. You aided other cadets. Explain. Kale stood, sliding the knife back into his belt. Survival isn't about equipment, ma'am. It's about adaptability, about knowing when your tools matter and when your skills matter more, and it's about understanding that sometimes survival means making sure everyone makes it out. He gestured to the assembled cadets. They had everything the coalition could give them. I had a knife and about 10,000 years of human stubbornness. Turns out, when everything fails, stubbornness wins. Back at the Orbital Academy, the debriefing room was packed. The Vraxis instructor stood before the assembled command staff, with Kale and the other cadets present. Holographic footage played on loop. Kale building fires, constructing shelters, dragging wounded through mud, teaching others how to purify water, using nothing but heat and patience. The Coalition's senior training officer, a Nextarian whose species had invented interstellar travel, while humans were still hunting mammoths, leaned forward. Let me understand this correctly. The human disregarded advanced technology in favor of a blade, and succeeded where 300 better-equipped cadets failed. 22 of us would have died without him. Harmonious Thought Cascade chimed. Our technology failed. His primitive methods did not. The senior officer's optical clusters focused on Kale. What possessed you to make this choice, Lieutenant? Kale chose his words carefully. Sir, humans learned a long time ago that the universe doesn't care about our gadgets. It doesn't malfunction when things get hard. Our tools do. But skills, knowledge, the ability to read weather and terrain and adapt, those don't run out of power. They don't break, and they can't be taken away. He paused. The Coalition has given the galaxy incredible technology, but technology is only as reliable as the conditions allow. My ancestors survived ice ages with stone tools. I figured I could handle a rainy weekend with steel. The room was silent. Finally, the Vraxis instructor spoke. In 20 years of running this program, I have watched cadets treat survival as a technological problem. They believe equipment will save them. You treated it as a human problem, and demonstrated capabilities we did not know still existed in your species. She turned to the command staff. I recommend we revise the training protocols. All cadets should receive baseline primitive survival instruction. If nothing else, they should understand what Lieutenant Rutger just taught us, that the being using the tool is more important than the tool itself. The final standings appeared on the Academy's main board. Lieutenant Kale Rutger, first place. Survival Exercise GX447. Mission completion, 72 hours. Equipment utilization, maximum efficiency with minimum resources. Leadership, 22 cadets rescued from critical situations. Innovation, adapted indigenous materials for survival needs. Special commendation, demonstrating core principles of coalition resilience. Vex Thorin stood before the board, his legs still in regeneration wraps. I owe you 500 credits. Kale grinned. Keep it. Buy me a drink instead. I owe you my life, human. A drink is insufficient. Then buy me several drinks. Around them, other cadets approached, species who'd spent their whole lives in climate-controlled habitats, who'd never been cold or hungry or truly afraid. They looked at Kale differently now, not with the vague condescension that humans often faced, but with something approaching respect. Harmonious thought cascade chimed softly. Will you teach us these skills you have? Kale considered the crystalline being. It'd take time, and it won't be comfortable. You'll get dirty. You'll fail a lot before you succeed. That is acceptable. We have seen what happens when we rely only on tools. We wish to rely also on ourselves. 6 months later, the Coalition Academy's wilderness training facility opened on Earth, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, where forests still grew wild and storms still rolled in from the ocean. Kale stood at the edge of a clearing, watching a new class of cadets nervously inspect their surroundings. 40 species, 200 students. Each had been issued a complete survival kit, and each had been told they could keep as much or as little of it as they wanted. The Vraxis instructor, now director of practical survival training, stood beside him. Her scales had settled into a contented amber. How many do you think will follow your example? She asked. Kale watched a young Nextarian cadet carefully set aside everything except a hatchet and a water flask. Watched a Torgathian keep only rope and a fire starter. Watched species who'd forgotten hardship remember that their ancestors had once been just as vulnerable, just as determined to survive. Enough, he said, the tools don't matter, the willingness to learn does. He pulled out his knife, the same blade now worn smooth from use and teaching. It had been his grandfather's before him, passed down through generations of Rutgers who'd understood that survival wasn't about having the best equipment. It was about being the kind of person who could make any equipment enough. All right, Kale called out to the assembled cadets. First lesson, fire. You're going to learn to make it 3 different ways, and none of them involve pushing a button. Everybody find a good stick and a flat rock. We're going primitive. Across the clearing, 200 beings from 200 worlds began the long process of remembering what their ancestors knew, that intelligence and adaptability beat technology every time. And in his belt, Kale's knife caught the sunlight. Just a simple tool, but in the right hands, enough to change the galaxy's understanding of what survival really meant.